welcome back everyone who is joining us for part two, and welcome to everyone who's joining us for part one. For those of you who have not yet met Wade, Wade was our keynote at our coaches conference and has agreed to continue doing our sessions, our lunch and learn sessions, as we build on communities of practice and psychological safety. And I will pass it over to him to get started. So welcome everybody, and we'll dig in.
Welcome. It's good to see everyone. And this, again, in the spirit of continuing the conversation, continuing to learn and grow together. We're going to extend what we started from the last session. And I did a little bit of research and some digging. So I'm gonna push us a little bit further today to have some reflection and some conversations around this big idea of, the type of environments that we want to create in our workspace, whether it's a team or a club or, organization wide. So great to see everyone again. Hope you're enjoying your summer and recharging the batteries a little bit. So what we'll do now, we'll just, as well, our standard practice, I guess, is say hi to someone else and just greet another teammate, so to speak. Then we'll dive into the content. So I'm going to stop sharing there and we can stop the recording. Right. Great to see everyone. And I'm glad you're all back here. A few other people want to get in on them. Okay. So we had a chance to say hi, and let's take a look at what I put together for today. So we had come to this point where we started to have a little bit of a discussion around psychological safety versus, brave environments. So a safe environment versus a brave environment. And I believe it was maybe Julie who highlighted this one. But we're gonna end it with this because I don't want to jump ahead. I went and did a little bit more research on this on my own because you got me thinking too, this is all fairly new in the space of sport. So we'll finish with this idea of brave environments. So when I started digging into it a little bit more, because these weren't terms that we were discussing when I was doing my PhD or going to school and doing research originally with coaches, and what I've found is that the term itself, psychological safety, you could maybe trace it back to around 1965, somewhere in that space, not in sport, but in the literature. So if you did want to go deeper on this, there is a body of literature around this, going back 50, 60 years. But the transfer to sport and coaching and sports science seems to just be in the last couple of years. The first study that I could find, a published study on this, is 2020. I'm sure people were talking about it before then, but in terms of trying to get some evidence and look at what does the research show us about this concept and how it might apply to coaching and sport, because for sure, and we'll get to it today, there is a power imbalance. Like it or not, right? I mean, we're trying to get people, whether they're kids or adults, to do things maybe they don't want to do or they don't think they can do. And in some cases, they have to do. So it is a bit of a unique relationship. And in fact, we may come around to this idea, I think I mentioned it before, transformational coaching is quite common in the sports science literature right now and is being advocated as a model approach, how we influence people. But the opposite of transformational is transactional. And my experience, maybe yours too, is coaching by definition has transactional moments. This isn't a debate or a discussion. You need to go over there and do this right now. So it's transformational and transactional, and this idea of transformational, maybe, right? Kind of meet in the middle. So it's always messier than it's portrayed in a podcast or a webinar or an article, right? So the early definition, this is what we shared from last time, feeling and belief that you can share your thoughts, opinions, and ideas freely without fear of being degraded or shamed. And that's not from a sports science perspective. That's kind of, original definition. So if we look more in terms of application or transfer to our space, what does a psychologically safe or psychological safe environment entail? What would that definition look like? And here we see it's an environment, right? So it's not necessarily a personal construct, it's more an environment within which I underline, take interpersonal risks by speaking up, sharing concerns, raising questions, offering ideas because they feel safe to do so. So to me, it's when we start to transfer into our space in sport and coaching, and it's less about the safety and more about empowerment, like empowering people to feel that they can be genuine and be themselves and be open, right? So that's why I underline take interpersonal risk, because we all see things all day long. I don't know if anybody's a Seinfeld fan, the show or the comedian, but there was a character on the show, Kramer, who basically said whatever popped into his mind, right? So where we always kind of control and hold back. And that's maybe good for relationship building at times, but it's maybe not great for performance, right? So this idea of a psychological safe environment, I think we want to reflect more on, are we creating a space, whether it's a one-on-one communication with an athlete or another coach or coaching staff or our club, right? Where people feel comfortable taking risks so they can put themselves out there and not hold back, right? And you may recall from the last session, we talked a little bit about Google X and the way they create brave environments, they call them. And it's really about we need you to take risks. That's how we're going to succeed. So it's also not, it's interesting to see what it isn't, right? It's not an environment devoid of conflict. So it's comfortable in the sense that you feel open and willing to take risks, but it's not comfortable in the sense that you're not pushed to take risks. So I like this quote again, I underlined here, and I'll share the slides with you and the articles if you want to look at them. The necessary functional and constructive conflict. I like that. So psychological safety does not imply a team where people are necessarily close friends or where there's never any conflict or problems. Psychological safety can facilitate necessary functional and constructive conflict as required to learn and improve how teams work together. So I mean, by definition, training, physical training, right, or any type of training requires some kind of conflict. You have to exert stress on the system or on the model to grow, right? So there's going to be conflict. So it's not about avoiding conflict. It's about creating an environment where people feel comfortable in confronting the conflict, leaning into the conflict, right? So this is where you can start to see how we can pull in literature from other fields and
Hi.
Hi.
That wasn't.
Yeah.
We all good? Okay.
Permet, I think you need to mute yourself.
We're going to have a breakout room here in a moment, but so again, kind of setting the stage and pushing you a little bit to reflect on these things, and we're not going to solve anything today, or as always, but we're going to maybe push the envelope a little bit more, reflect a little bit more. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take a pause, and before I show you some of the research findings in sport, the few studies that I was able to find. So given what I shared with you, moving from this big concept of psychological safety to a psychological safe environment in a team or in sport, the way that's defined, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms and have you just share for a couple minutes or reflect on that. And it could be in a sport example. It could be in your workplace. Maybe it's even in school or family. or some other environment. But have you lived in an environment, even for a short period of time, that really fit that definition? If we look back here, necessary, functional, constructive conflict, where you felt safe to lean into that conflict and challenge each other and challenge other people, regardless of status or position. So I'm going to pause the Zoom. Okay, so I'm not going to ask for group sharing at the moment because I want to be careful with our time here. And we will have some group sharing after the next pause. So let's keep moving. So looking at some of the research that I was able to find specific to sport, this idea of psychological safety in sport environments and in teams. And one of the probably most sophisticated studies on this topic, and again, if you wanted copies of these, I'm happy to share them with you. What came out of research in England, and this woman, her name's Sophia Jowett, she is the preeminent researcher on coach-athlete relationships. And so it's interesting to see that she's now pushed that topic by bringing in other literature and other theories and other models, and specifically this idea of psychological safety, but looking at the relationship components, the coach-athlete relationship. And she adapted a model that was adapted from other fields into sport to help kind of big picture think about what is psychological safety in sports settings. So on one side of this equation, the left side, if you're facing your screen, would be the antecedents, the things that influence psychological safety in a sport environment. So you have your intrapersonal, which is, you personally, your emotions, your thoughts, your attitude, your mindset, things like that, your communication skills. Interpersonal, you between teammates, between staff members. Organizational, so at the organization or club level, what are some of those factors? Environmental, even higher, and then cultural, right? The different parts of the country, right, have different kind of cultural traditions, and maybe your club does, or countries and things like that, language. So all those things influence our ability to create psychologically safe environments. And not saying this is the answer or the right way, but at the moment, this is how it's kind of viewed in sport. The whole purpose of trying to create psychological safety is to build better athlete outcomes. And you may have come across this before. It was interesting to me when I saw this, because this is based on research I did, where we created a definition of effective coaching. And the goal of good coaching is what we call the 4 C's of athlete outcomes. So competence, confidence, connection, and character. We want better skilled athlete. We want more resilient athlete. We want a better person in terms of character, and the connection is interpersonal skills. So the thinking is, if we invest in creating these psychologically safe environments, we're going to have better athlete holistic development. Okay. But I think in addition here, you would add the environmental outcomes. So not just in this study, they were looking at the athlete outcomes, but it's much bigger than just the athlete, I think. So specific to coach-athlete relationships and psychological safety, the way they defined it, an environment where every athlete feels heard, valued, and connected. And you don't see the word safe. It's more about being recognized, being noticed, being heard, being seen. So it's kind of like validation. It's honoring their existence, which is language we would never have used, in my experience in coaching 20, 30 years ago. Honoring their existence, who gives a shit? Like, that's not that this is the space we're in. I'm not saying it's good or bad, right or wrong, but this is where we've shifted, which makes it very hard to coach at times. but also makes coaching much more rewarding, I think. So when they looked at their research, and they had, I think, 370 different athletes who responded to this questionnaire, openness and conflict management predicts psychological safety. So environments, relationships, clubs, where there's openness that's nurtured and part of the environment, part of the culture, and strategies and investment in learning how to manage conflict, that does definitely contribute to psychological safety. Also, communication, we come to communication again. So athlete communication, the willingness to share what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're feeling, be open and honest in their communication, is also highly associated with the quality of the coach-athlete relationship, which is highly associated with psychological safety. So we had a term when I was working with the national team leading up to the Olympics. We had some workshops, and we created a language, right? So the way I look at this, what is the language? Because language is culture. So what is the language that we use? How do we speak to each other in our club, in our environment, in our office, in our training environments? And we ban the word fine with our national team. So when someone passes you in the gym, in the hallway, in the parking lot, and say, hey, how you doing? You say, fine. No, you can't say fine, because fine is, the acronym they used was, F it, not engaging. So when you say you're fine, basically you're not interested in having a conversation. Yeah, everything's fine. We're fine. There's always stuff to talk about. So you're not allowed to say fine, right? So that's just an example. But this is the area that really caught my attention. They use this term, a climate of voice. And I'll let you read that there. The athlete's capacity to communicate with coaches and feel psychologically safe with teammates or fellow athletes or other coaches. Every voice is heard and respected is an important ingredient to making inherently competitive environment happier and kinder. Again, our goal is not to create happy and kind environments, but we do need to create environments. I mean, what's wrong with being happy, right? I mean, that's a great outcome, having an environment where people feel, safe and comfortable and happy. But as you know, trying to be world class in something, or even to move up a level, is not always enjoyable and not about being happy. But the idea here, I love this idea of a climate of voice. So it recognizes the importance of being heard, being seen, allowing people to have their voice. And you're going to see, like, in many traditional ways of coaching, like debriefs, feedback, the athlete doesn't really get a voice. They're told or they're shown. And definitely there's a place for that. But learning this, can we reflect a little bit more in terms of opportunities for athletes or teammates or other staff members to have a voice, a public voice? Because we all have a private voice that happens across every team and every club and every organization, the private side conversations, but a public voice, a shared voice, a team voice, right? So to me, this is a very interesting concept that I only really just stumbled across very recently. We're going to pause in a moment, but I want to show you one other study that I thought was interesting. Again, very, very recent. And this one with, in North American context, Division I athletes across different sports, female athletes in this particular study. This was actually interviewing athletes, asking them about these, and I would think, I didn't do it here, but I'm going to send it out, Julie. The interview questions that they used in this study, I think would be really interesting to use in your club or your team to kind of gauge the temperature of our club in terms of how well we create a climate of voice. So I will share that after. but there were four themes that really stood out. And these are the four right here that came out of that particular research. Making a note here. So the interpersonal relationships, the communication part, accountability is really, really important. Being vulnerable. But the one that really squashed psychologically safe environments was suppressing people's voice, and in particular athletes, right? Suppressing their voice. And we might not think we're doing that, but the athletes, again, in this study, they felt that this was happening. And I'll let you read these two quotes that I thought were revealing. And these are from athletes in that study. One, there are boundaries set by the coaches because they'll be like, I've been coaching skiing as long as you've been alive. I know more about this sport than you've forgotten. And I'm sure we've all heard, similar language about that. Another athlete, it feels very frustrating, like when you're not being truly seen or heard for your perspective. I think oftentimes the coach's perspective, what happened in a competition, is projected onto your experience instead of like my experience being heard and evaluated and then discussing. And so this is hard. This is hard. There's time limitations, there's space, human resource limitations. Sometimes we just need to say things and move on. But I want us to reflect on this idea of a climate of voice. And so I'm going to stop here for a moment, and I'm just going to have an open it up to the whole group here, and not put us in the breakout rooms because we really only have about 10 minutes left here. So I'm going to pause for a moment. Who wants to jump in here on this idea of a climate of voice?
I can make a point.
Yeah.
Okay, it's definitely a tour from Waterloo. One of my earliest experiences as an athlete, which worked so well, is our coach, I'll mention it by name, Don McKinnon, had a log book. And at the end of each race, we basically went into this little moment of isolation, or even the day after, and we just wrote down the whole race experience from our perspective. And then, like, sometimes a week later or days later, he would address what he read, because this was before computer age. I'm old, okay? But we handed him his log book with this sheet, and then the conversation came back a few days later or even a week later. And then everybody had some distance, but he was able to read our voice. And so I don't remember ever this like deep briefing, right afterwards with the coach commenting upon the experience. That's something that I think is really important. There's a video that was shared once, I think in one of the Cross Country Canada, is like The Drive Home, it's called, is about some kid in a car, that's going home after the hockey game or whatever, and it's just a berating. And that's like a perfect example of no voice. But I just remember that log that, here, write down what you think, and then days later there was a discussion.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I love it.
And I still have those log books from 1990, from the early 1990s. I showed my kids that, and they just laughed at the old fonts and everything like that of these. But it worked. It was a way of growing, and sort of very respectfully.
Have you tried similar strategies since?
I haven't, just because I've been not actively coaching to the point I have that kind of responsibility. I'm very much in the periphery, just helping here, out and there, but I'm not a head coach or anything like that to make those kind of shots, so to speak.
Well, I'll get other people to jump in here. It's really fascinating, Stefan. Thank you for sharing. And we all most athletes, especially in this type of sport, keep training logs, right? Extensive training diaries and training logs, very technical, and race times and splits and things like that, distance. But I know I've started to see more and more teams, clubs, organizations using athlete monitoring platforms, right? And they can be proprietary, subscription-based platforms. I know there was a company in Toronto that was experimenting with that with Olympic teams a while back, to just, Google Forms, where athletes after every training, or each day, they kind of check in, like rate your sleep last night, rate your energy level, just subjective scores, right? But I haven't really seen one that gives athletes voice. It's really been more monitoring, even that term, right? Like you're being monitored, which is very different than giving them a voice. Other thoughts or ideas here?
I could share something.
Yeah.
As coaching in a club, I drive a lot the team in buses and stuff like that. And often when we finish a race or a camp or a training or whatever, I just ask to have a conversation, everybody together. How did it go for everybody today? And everything that pops out from there is really interesting because it's all elements I could use afterwards. And getting, like he said, getting the voice of the athletes through my talking is really great. And what's really fun about that is that the athletes after say, hey, how did you have your day too, Diane? So it's like we're all human around this. So it's really a privilege to drive them around like that. So it makes, instead of having them all on their phone or something, the habit is there of saying, hey, how did it go? So all the new athletes on the team get shaped up by the others. I'm not the one doing it if they're doing it. So that's one thing I like to do with them. And the skiing part, with what you just post out, saying that coaches, I have a lot of experience, so stuff like that. Well, I'm not a skier, so I need the athletes to feed me a lot. So how are you going to ski this? How are you going to do this with all the tools we worked on, So I make them speak a lot, so I don't talk that much. So that's it.
No, I love it. And it's funny, that example you shared, because I find the more you model, like you are the message, right? So the more you model a climate of voice where you try and engage people and give them space to share their voice, it'll pop up in the most unexpected way, or moments where some kid will ask you before you even get a chance to do what you want to do, hey, how was your weekend? How was your day? And it kind of catches you off guard at first because you're so used to being the one telling and doing and asking. Oh, this 12-year-old kid just asked me how my day was.
Recording in progress.
Other thoughts or
Just remember to mute if you're not talking.
Okay, there we go. Other thoughts, examples, or pushback, or just trying to have a conversation again around this idea of a climate of voice?
Yeah, Wade, I have a question for you with your research and coach expertise, these types of things that Stefan has mentioned and Diane. How does a coach hear that voice and reflect that in their future practice plans, so that athletes actually see the belonging in the actions of the coach and not just that they got to express something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, to me, it's always a work in progress, right? So you never arrive, you never finished. Like, we got it. It's always a work in progress. So you have to work it. It's like a training principle, right? You use it or lose it. So it's got to be, to me, it has to be embedded in our daily operational habits. How we start a practice, how we end a practice, how we start a meeting, how we end a meeting, how we communicate with each other. Those are all little moments that reinforce the type of communication that we want to have here. So it can't be a workshop and then we go back to doing what we did before. And I see that a lot with teams. They'll do a preseason workshop, or they'll have a facilitator come in and then they leave and nothing changes, right? So it's got to be the little regular habits that you create. So one of the things I started doing a while back is just always, whether it's a team meet like we did today, right? Like the first thing when we get together, we have space. It's not extra time. I'm not extending training. You know, this is part of our training. The first 3 minutes, 5 minutes is joke of the day, or we all say hi to somebody just like we did today. And I actually did this when I was coaching kids ice hockey, probably 6 years ago, 12-year-olds. And we would always have a joke of the day, and from them, not from me. And I let it takes different forms. And of course there were some missteps there because there were some jokes that were not appropriate to be shared, but you learn after the fact, like, oh, I guess I better bet the jokes. But the idea was, that became part of our training. That wasn't if time or once in a while. So you build these habits where you force them to communicate, you force them to be vulnerable. You also have to model it, right? So you have to share, you have to be willing to do that as well. But and it'll be different with every group of athletes that you have, right? Each group will look a little different in terms of what people are, where you can start that process. So long answer to that question, what I've seen to be the most powerful way is not a specific strategy, but embedding that, whatever the strategy is, into your regular way of operating. So it's part of our standard practice. This is how we do things here. And then it just becomes normalized. And I remember one time, the commander of the US Navy one time was sharing, one of the strategies that they use to create, Navy SEALs. And he said, our motto is, we normalize the abnormal. So we're asking you to do abnormal things, in their case, really abnormal. But even we could think when we work with kids, it's not normal for kids to talk to each other, like verbally talk to each other, or to an adult, right? Have a conversation with an adult. That's not necessarily normal anymore. So how do we normalize the abnormal? And what are specific little interventions and strategies, routines that we embed into our daily environment? And you won't really know until you try, right? It's test, experiment, and you'll figure out, oh, that worked, that didn't work, that seemed to stick. So that's been my example. We used to do a little joke of the day. We used to have, how you doing? We used to have free play time for 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of a training session. And then always finish with something fun. We'd have a little debrief. I'd have captains or assistant captains. We'd always have before coach shares what they think the session looked like today, athletes would share. And again, you can't just expect someone to go from 0 to 60. So you can't expect someone to just all of a sudden be vulnerable and put them on the spot. So I would coach them into those moments. So I would let a kid know during practice, or maybe before practice, hey, Kevin, today I'm going to ask you to share some observations after practice, okay? So they have time to work through that, not just at the end of practice looking around the circle. Okay, Kevin, what do you think? And Kevin's like, doesn't want to look embarrassed. And so don't put them in those spots unless they've been coached into those moments as well.
Right. So there's those strategies, those things you can bring into your practice. And I guess those are revealing things about the diversity of your athletes, why they're there, what's their why for being there, which, you're being informed why they're there. In the case of the race log that Stefan talks about, Don is then being informed of where athletes' performance capacities are. And then that can be something that informs his practice planning as well, right? And
yeah, but to that point, trust underpins all of this. So if you're going to ask me to share my opinion in a training log or in a group setting, I have to trust that that's going to be used in a way that doesn't harm me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I find, especially with more sophisticated athletes, higher level athletes, when you start to introduce some of these things, the first question, who's going to read this?
Mm-hmm.
Who else is going to see this? Right? Like, they're skeptical, you know, is this going to be used against me in team selection at some point? Like, they're kind of programmed to be skeptical and not trustworthy. Maybe they've been burned in the past, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
thinking about how we prime them for those strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other thoughts? Who else wants to jump in? Julie?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really like your question, Kevin. In terms of like, how do you make this valuable? I had a pretty eye-opening experience at a international regatta with some young athletes once in canoeing, and the athlete had done a great race, outperformed what we thought they were going to do, and the entire coaching staff was super excited, and we're all, you know, you go and you're like, yay, great job, sort of idea. And it wasn't until we were in the van going home, and it was just, this was pre-Safe Sport, so please don't judge, but we were in the van and I was driving the athlete back to the hotel, and the athlete just looked crushed, and I was like, are you all right? And they're like, well, I wasn't really happy with that race. And I was just like, oh, shoot, like, okay. And they sort of, they had different expectations of what they wanted to do and stuff like that. And it was an eye opener. It was like, oh, wow, like we didn't even ask you how you felt. We just told you how we felt. And it was actually this athlete that sort of helped me come up with this thing that I used afterwards, which was, I would never, it wasn't my place anymore to tell the athlete how their race went. We came up with this little process. Well, she walked me through and we self-discovered, and we called it the good, the bad, the ugly, and the awesome. And I wasn't, it was no longer my position as a coach to go in and tell them how their race was. They told me. And so we started, you know, the next race, it was like, okay, what was good, what was bad, what was ugly, what was awesome. And then it was like, okay, well, what would you like to work on? What would you like to work on? And then that we took out and became the next practice, right? Like, it was like, okay, so this is how we're going to program your practices moving forward. Is you've now told me where you felt your gap was. And of course, like as a coach, I would continue to inform that and be like, okay, well, that we're going to need to do this for you to be able to work on that, if that was the case. But it was really neat because it was actually the athlete who taught me that, like, in terms of like, wow, my exact reaction was to go tell the athlete what a great race they had. Meanwhile, the athlete had a completely different experience. And I totally didn't validate that until I had a moment to have that opportunity to talk to them in the car. And it was just like, wow, okay, that was humbling and embarrassing, but super good, because it really created this awesome process that we use. And then I took into my other coaching, like with other athletes and stuff like that, was like, all right, what was good, what was bad, what was ugly, what was awesome, and what do you want to work on? And then that's what fed into my capacity to write the next week's training plans or the next month's training plans. So it's just, anyways, it was really neat because I listened to the athlete and I learned. So anyways, thanks for letting me share that.
Well, we're just about at our time here. We just have a couple.
Joshua's got his hand up. Sorry, Wade.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to ask one quick question about what was just said. So with that, is there ever a point, like having the athlete inform on what was a good race or a bad race, for example, is there ever a point where it becomes kind of the coach's role of the athlete saying, no, I had a terrible race, nothing went well, but they may have performed better than like a coach may have expected, where maybe that athlete just beat themselves up and it becomes your job to like validate, respect their feelings, but also pull them back from that kind of self-deprecation spot? And kind of where's that line draw from of we're still respecting their voice, but also not taking it away from them, but trying to support them in the same time, if that makes sense?
Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, I was just curious. That's an awesome question, because you're always afraid that if they're sitting there beating themselves up, you're like, oh, wait, no. I think that's where I actually asked that athlete that question. And I said, well, and that's where we came up with the good and the awesome part of it, was the good, the bad, the ugly, the awesome, was they didn't have a choice. They had to be able to find the good and the bad. And then what was neat was when I used it later, the athletes, for the most part, like I would say 95% of the time, were able to be very balanced in their feedback to themselves, right? Because they were forced to think of something good and something awesome, but they were also fair because they had to think of something bad and ugly. But that's my personal experience. Wade, you may have had better or more, but I think in having them look at it in a balanced way, they had no choice but to find good and bad, as opposed to just like, I sucked. It was like, oh no, I actually was, I actually warmed up really well this time. Or, one time the athlete was like, I remembered to put underwear on. I'll never forget that one. And I was like, hey, good on ya. So yeah. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that was a U23 that said that. So I was kind of like, we may have other things to work on. But anyways, sorry.
No, I like it. And again, this is fascinating discussion. I really love that, people are sharing here, and Josh, great question. But I kind of wonder about the good, the bad, and the ugly, because I've seen lots of variations of that as well, right? But then now that I'm learning more about this and we're reflecting more, is that really honoring their voice, or is that forcing them to share something that maybe they don't want to share or is not relevant to them, but we're making them find something to say? Versus, going back to Stefan's original example of just kind of a free form, your experience, share your experience, what you thought of the race, and let them. I'm almost thinking maybe you start with the free form. Let's see where they're at. Let's see where their head's at. Let's see what, let's get to know who we're working with. And I like writing better than verbalizing, at least initially, because it's safe, it's non-threatening, and maybe with kids now, maybe it's texting or some digital platform, but just let's see where they're at. And then you can kind of calibrate, maybe, Julie, right? Where this kid is always just looking at the positives, this kid's always looking at the negatives. Maybe it becomes a little bit more customized versus everybody's got to find a good, a bad, and ugly. Maybe. But that's just an initial kind of reflection based on the discussion today, and really trying to think deeper about what that means to create a climate of voice. Yeah, just thoughts.
Wait, may I just add the two extremes, the free verse versus the very guided voice? I'm a secondary teacher, and I have students do a lot of journals and various courses, and I give both options because some kids need a starting point, and the free verse just freaks them out. It's just like, I get one sentence. That's not what, but so they have the guided voice there, but the free space. And then nowadays, what I also do is some kids I let type, others I have them do a voice recording because they're much more verbal as a communicator. Some of them hate typing. And so that way I catch those two types of preferred ways of communicating. I know another teacher saying like, you know what, you put a video of yourself and they're talking to the screen. So that way you catch a broader spectrum of young people or athletes, but you also give a bit of guidance, but also free verse. And then you have the both worlds available to the athlete, and they will gravitate to wherever they would feel comfortable, I'm hoping.
I love it.
Yeah, I think that's the art of coaching right there. Like, I don't think I would use the exact good, bad, and ugly. And I was feeling very empowered because it was the athlete that had suggested that. And so listening to their process and then adapting it to the different types of athletes that you work with.
Could I just add one quick thing about that? Like Stefan said, having the free and the guided. Into the guided, instead of being into qualifying something, with my athletes, I try to get them more objective. Like, what did you control and what did you not control? So I'm more on those. I try not to qualify, but finding facts. Then after they could think whatever they want about it. So that's how I work.
Yeah, this fantastic. This is all fantastic. And I think that the principle is consistent across the board here, using whatever mechanisms you have available to give them options and a space where they can honestly and openly share their experience with that, because ultimately I think we want them to own the experience. We don't want them to feel like they're a puppet, right? And they're being trained. Like, this is and you know that from the best athletes are the ones who want it. They own it. They take ownership of it, right? So I think this also pushes and nourishes that ownership of the experience. You're not a spectator. You're not coming to be coached and trained and controlled. You have to take control, like grab the wheel. You have to take control of this experience, if you want to see how far you can really get with it. Nathaniel had his hand up.
Yeah, Wade, I'm just listening to what like Stefan and Julie. It sounds like, and Deanne, they all have kind of different approaches to getting the athlete to ultimately analyze what they've done. And I'm wondering what I guess, how do you start that conversation with the athlete properly, and how do you find out what works best for them, whether it's having that good, bad, ugly conversation, or if it's, maybe an athlete just wants to go write in private in their journal and analyze it. How do you just understand what works, or learn how to understand what works best for that athlete and cater to that?
I have some thoughts, but go ahead, Diane.
Well, it's the relationship. You've got to build up a relationship first. If you want to have someone to speak out, he has to feel, like you said, safe. Have a safe spot and have someone with who he's ready to share things. But sometimes it's waiting for the good moment and leaving space for it to be alone, and then it's going with the feeling. I go with the feeling. That's what I do.
Yeah, that, like you say, that's kind of the artistry of coaching, but there's a science behind the art, right? Being aware, and emotional intelligence, right, plays a big role in this. And those are learned skills. But I think a couple ideas. Well, the big idea is you introduce the concept to the athlete or the athletes. So here's an idea. We're going to try and open up communication more, or we're going to try and give you more. I want to learn more about, what this looks like from your perspective or from your vantage point. And the only way that we can really do that is for you to share things with me. So there's lots of different ways we can do that, and then draw them into the conversation so they kind of co-create it. Well, you'll know right away. Some will say, I don't know, what do you want to do, right? Okay, well, let's try this. Others will be, oh, well, I did this in school, or I had a teammate or another coach I did this with. Okay, let's try that. So one of my favorite quotes is, don't let best get in the way of better. And oftentimes we hold ourselves back from advancing because we have an idea, but it's not quite ready. Or I need more time to think about it, or I don't want to fail, or I don't want to mess it up. You take a step, you learn. You take a step, you learn. You take a step, you learn. So having the conversation with the athlete about the idea, here's the idea of something that I know will help you, get better. There's lots of different ways we can do that. I have some thoughts. What do you think? And then try something. And if it works, keep going. If it doesn't, try something else. That's the only way that I've seen that is really great organizations, great teams. They're learning organizations. They're constantly experimenting, trying things. So as opposed to waiting till we get it right. And the other thing to consider too is athletes respect other athletes. So if you have had success with another athlete, or know of another athlete and a coach who's done similar things, could you have that athlete communicate with your athlete? Say, hey, if you're still wondering why we're doing this, or if you have reservations, talk to Julie. have a chat with Julie, because we did that. Julie and I did this, and she found it really helped her. And athlete testimonials really seem to, peer support, right? Peer testimonials really seem to help bring athletes along when you're trying to nudge them. Well, Julie, we're over our time, and I know we're the juices are flowing. We're really some great conversations here, but we have a third part to this. We have another, the conversations will continue, and I hope you continue the conversations, with people in your space as well. So I think this would be a good place to pause, Julie.
No, I think this is great. I very much appreciate everyone being on the call and sharing ideas. Hopefully people are walking away with maybe ideas, or at least stimulating some thought on how we can continue to become better coaches and create those environments. Did you call it the climate of voice? A climate of voice, which I thought was a great way to say it. So thank you again, Wade. Just for those who are on the call, housekeeping, I have taken your names and your down for your NCCP PD points, so we'll make sure that we track that as well. Yes, I always make someone just commented on mixing up the time zones. I do that all the time. But we will have one more session, at least one more session with Wade. So keep an eye out on the coaches WhatsApp group for when that will be coming. And then again, Wade, we will be bugging you for the Sophia Jowett and the Kelsey Sachs articles, as well as your PowerPoint slides again today. And then once Nathaniel gets the recording done, it will be up on our YouTube for anyone who wasn't able to join us or would like to go back and just listen to those conversations again. So thanks everyone for your questions and your involvement today.